My daughter-in-law's mother snapped her fingers at my son like he was a dog fetching a stick, and he obeyed. That's the moment I knew something was rotten in that house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began. On the night I almost didn't notice anything was wrong at all. My granddaughter grabbed my sleeve and pulled me toward the coat closet, her small fingers digging into the fabric with a strength I didn't know an 8-year-old had. "Grandpa," she whispered, "we have to go home right now." I looked down at her, confused. "Why, sweetheart? The party just started." She wouldn't answer. She just kept glancing over her shoulder toward the kitchen, toward the sound of her father's raised voice trying to sound calm and failing. She didn't say another word until we were in my truck, seatbelt buckled, engine running. Then she turned to me with an expression no child should ever wear and asked, "Grandpa, did you see what Daddy signed?" What she told me next made my hands go cold on the steering wheel. "My name is Walter Boone. I'm 63 years old, and for 38 of those years I ran Boone sheet metal out of a machine shop in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the same shop my own father started with 2 employees and a bank loan he almost didn't get. I built it into something that put 300 people to work and put my son, Caleb, through engineering school without a dime of debt. My wife, Ruth, and I didn't come from money. We came from overtime and layaway, and a marriage that survived 39 years because we never once lied to each other about anything that mattered. Everything Caleb has, we gave him with open hands, no strings, because that's what you do for your children. Or so I believed, right up until the night of his housewarming. Caleb had married a woman named Dana 3 years earlier, a real estate agent with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Not that I said so out loud. Ruth liked her well enough. I kept my opinions to myself because that's what a father does when his son is happy, or what looks like happy. 6 months ago, Caleb came to me with a business plan for a second manufacturing line, something to modernize the shop and take us into aerospace parts contracting. I believed in it. I believed in him. I put up $850,000 of my retirement, structured as a loan against future company equity, with the paperwork drawn up by my own attorney, a man named Frank Delgado who'd handled Boone Sheet Metal's affairs for 20 years. Caleb used part of that money, along with a mortgage, to buy a 5-bedroom house in the Highland Park neighborhood, the kind of house I never had and never needed. Tonight was the party to celebrate it. The driveway was lined with cars I didn't recognize, expensive ones, the kind that cost more than my first house. Inside, the place smelled like candles that were trying too hard, and almost immediately, something felt off. Caleb wasn't greeting guests at his own front door. Dana wasn't either. Instead, a woman I'd met maybe 3 times, Dana's mother, Sandra Whitfield, was standing in the middle of the living room holding court like she was the one who'd built the company. She was pointing out the crown molding to a cluster of admiring neighbors, talking about our vision for the place, as though she'd swung a hammer herself. I told myself she was just proud of her daughter. I told myself a lot of things that night that turned out to be wrong. I found Caleb in the kitchen, refilling a tray of shrimp cocktail he clearly didn't need to be refilling himself when he had a house full of caterers. He looked thin, tired in a way that had nothing to do with hosting a party. When I asked him how the new line was coming along, how the aerospace contract was progressing, his eyes darted toward the doorway before he answered, like he was checking who might be listening. "It's coming," he said, slower than we thought. Before I could ask what that meant, Dana appeared out of nowhere, looped her arm through his, and steered him toward a group of her sorority friends. It happened so smoothly I almost didn't clock it as deliberate. Almost. That's when I saw the thing with the shoes. Sandra wanted to show off the imported Italian tile in the foyer, and she told Caleb, not asked, told him, to get down and check whether the caterers had scuffed it with their cartwheels. My son, a mechanical engineer who designs load-bearing structures for a living, got down on his knees, on his own tile floor, in his own house, in front of his own guests, and ran his fingers along the grout like a man checking for a crime scene. Nobody else in that room seemed to notice anything strange about it. I noticed. Ruth noticed. Our granddaughter, Lily, noticed most of all, which is why she grabbed my sleeve 20 minutes later and asked to go home. In the truck, in the dark of the driveway, Lily told me what she'd seen 3 days earlier at her own house. She said her daddy had been crying at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, and her mommy told him to sign it or she was taking Lily and leaving. She said he signed it. She didn't know what it was. She was 8. She just knew her father cried, and her mother wasn't kind about it, and something about the company and Grandpa's shop had come up more than once in a way that scared her enough to remember it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Ruth, who was awake too, staring at the ceiling fan, and I told her what Lily said. Ruth didn't say that's ridiculous or you're overreacting, which is what I half expected. She said, Walter, I've thought Dana's mother was running that marriage since the wedding. I just didn't want to believe our son would let her run it into us. The next morning I called Frank Delgado, my attorney, and asked him to quietly pull the most recent filings on Boone Sheet Metal's equity structure, the ones tied to my loan agreement with Caleb. He called me back 4 hours later, and his voice had a flatness to it I'd only heard once before. The day he told me my father's old partner had tried to write himself into the will after the funeral. Frank told me there was a new holding entity listed as a lien holder against company equity, something called Prairie Vista Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware, filed 11 days ago. He told me it had no listed employees, no service history, nothing but a mailing address that traced to a UPS store 2 miles from Sandra Whitfield's condominium. I sat with that for a long moment. $850,000 of my life's work, converted on paper into leverage that a shell company in Delaware could apparently now claim a piece of. I asked Frank the only question that mattered. How? He said the amended operating agreement bore my son's signature, notarized, dated the same week. Lily said she saw him crying at the kitchen table. I want to tell you my first instinct was rage. It wasn't. My first instinct was grief. The specific grief of realizing your child might not be the man you raised, or worse, might be a good man being slowly ground down by people who saw him as a door to something bigger. I decided, right there in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand, that I wasn't going to confront anybody yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. A man doesn't dismantle a wall by punching it. He finds the load-bearing point first. So I became, deliberately, a little smaller, a little slower. At the next family dinner, I let my hands shake slightly when I reached for my water glass. Not enough to alarm anyone, just enough that Sandra's eyes flicked toward Dana with something like calculation. I stopped asking sharp questions about the business. I let Caleb think I hadn't noticed the shift in him. I told Ruth what I was doing, and only Ruth, because I needed one person in that house who wasn't performing for anyone. Meanwhile, I hired a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, someone Frank vouched for personally, someone with no connection to our family or our town. I paid her out of a separate account Sandra's people would never think to look at. My late father's original business account, still technically active, still technically mine. Priya started pulling threads I didn't even know existed. Prairie Vista Consulting wasn't the only shell. There were 2 others, one in Nevada and one in Wyoming, both tied to the same UPS mailbox, both created within the same 8-week window that Caleb's marriage had apparently been under strain. Money had moved from Boone Sheet Metal's supplier accounts, small amounts, invoice by invoice, routed through Prairie Vista as a consulting fee for services no one could document. Over 14 months, it added up to just under $200,000. Small enough that our bookkeeper, a good woman who'd worked for me for a decade, hadn't flagged it as anything but normal vendor churn. Large enough that someone had been planning this for a long time. 3 weeks into Priya's investigation, my computer did something strange. I want to be honest, I'm not a technology man. I still call my grandson every time the printer jams, but even I understood what it meant when the screen of my old laptop, the one connected to the company's shared drive, flashed red and locked itself with a message that said, "Security alert. Unauthorized access attempt detected. Administrator notified." My IT contractor, a sharp kid named Marcus who'd set up our systems years ago, called me within the hour, his voice tight. Someone had been trying to access the company's original founding documents, the ones that specified I retained sole controlling authority over any equity transfer above a certain threshold, a clause Frank had insisted on decades ago as boilerplate protection. Someone had tried to access it 3 times in the past week, using credentials that traced back to Caleb's work laptop, not Caleb typing it himself. Marcus was fairly sure. The access attempts happened at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Times my son, an early riser who is asleep by 10 most nights, would never be awake. I asked Marcus one question. Who else has access to that laptop? He said technically only Caleb. Practically, anyone who knew his passcode, which he'd mentioned once at a barbecue, was his daughter's birthday, a fact half the family knew, including, I'd bet everything I owned, Dana. That was the night I stopped hoping this was a misunderstanding. I called a meeting, not a confrontation, A meeting, with Frank and Priya both, and we laid out everything on my kitchen table. The shell companies, the rerouted invoices, the 2 a.m. access attempts on documents that would let someone, if they succeeded, quietly amend the company's operating structure to strip my controlling clause and replace it with language favorable to Prairie Vista Consulting, meaning favorable to whoever actually controlled Prairie Vista, meaning, according to the Delaware filing, Priya finally cracked open using a public records request and one very persistent process server, Sandra Whitfield herself, listed as managing member under her maiden name. Sandra wasn't just an overbearing mother-in-law enjoying her daughter's success. Sandra was trying to engineer a slow-motion, hostile takeover of a company her son-in-law didn't even own outright, using her own daughter's marriage as the access point and using my son's fear of losing that marriage, of losing Lily, as the lever. I asked Frank one more question that night. Could this actually have worked? He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. He said if I hadn't caught it. If the amended agreement Caleb signed at that kitchen table had gone 30 more days without me exercising my original controlling clause, the shell company's claim would have solidified into something a judge might genuinely have had to weigh in. A costly, ugly legal fight I could very possibly have lost simply on paperwork, technicalities, regardless of what actually happened around that kitchen table. Caleb hadn't just been coerced. He'd been coerced in a way specifically engineered to survive scrutiny. I thought about Lily grabbing my sleeve. I thought about my son on his knees, checking Italian tile for scuff marks. And I made a decision that night that I've turned over in my mind every day since, because it wasn't an easy one, and I don't think it should have been. I decided the confrontation needed to happen in front of everyone who'd enabled it, and it needed to happen before that 30-day window closed. Frank drew up the paperwork to formally and immediately exercise my controlling clause, freezing any pending equity transfer and requiring board reapproval, meaning my approval, for anything touching the company's ownership structure. Priya compiled a report clean enough to hand directly to the Tulsa County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, who I'll admit I called with real fear in my chest, because pressing forward meant I couldn't control anymore what happened to my son's marriage, or to Lily's home, or to any of it. Ruth held my hand across that kitchen table and said the only thing I needed to hear. You already lost the son you thought you had the night Lily grabbed your sleeve. The only question now is whether you get a better one back. I asked Caleb to bring Dana and Sandra to dinner at our house, told him it was a peace offering, that I wanted to smooth things over after feeling distant lately. He came. They all came. Sandra practically gliding in like she owned that too. I let dinner go pleasantly. I let Sandra talk about a new development property she was eyeing. Funded, she said with a little too much pride, by some smart consulting work her firm had been doing. I let Dana compliment Ruth's cooking with a warmth I now understood to be entirely performance. And when the plates were cleared, I set a folder on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I want that understood, because I think that's what actually broke the room open. The fact that I stayed perfectly calm while I told them what was in the folder. The Delaware filings, the rerouted invoices, the forensic timeline of the shell companies, dated and cross-referenced, the IT log showing access attempts on our founding documents at 2 and 3 in the morning from Caleb's laptop, credentials that Marcus, present in my dining room by then, could testify were shared knowledge in that household. And finally, the letter from my attorney, already filed that afternoon, exercising my controlling clause and freezing the entire equity structure, pending a full audit. Sandra's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A kind of controlled collapse. All the performed graciousness draining out at once, replaced by something harder and colder that I think was probably closer to who she'd always been. She said the word gift, the way Frank had warned me she might, told me the invoices were legitimate consulting fees, called my investigation an act of paranoid control over my son's independence. Dana said nothing at all for a long time, which told me everything. Caleb was the one who finally spoke, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12 years old, and told me he'd wrecked my truck. He said, "Dad, she told me if I didn't sign, she'd help Dana take Lily and leave the state. She said she had the money and the lawyers to make sure I never won custody." He looked at Sandra when he said it, and for the first time all night, Sandra didn't have an answer ready. I told them, still calm, that the district attorney's office already had Priya's report, that this wasn't a family disagreement anymore, that it had become a criminal matter the moment someone tried to defraud a company through forged consulting invoices and coerced signatures. I told Sandra I hoped, for Dana's sake, that she hadn't dragged her daughter into something she couldn't walk back from. Sandra stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped, said something about respected community standing and slander, and left. Dana didn't follow her right away. She sat there for almost a full minute, staring at the folder, before she finally looked at Caleb and asked, quietly, "Did you know about the custody threat before tonight?" He said yes. She asked why he never told her. He said because he was afraid of losing her too, and afraid of what her mother would do if he tried to fight back alone. I won't pretend the months after that were simple. They weren't. The Financial Crimes Unit built its case slowly, the way these things do. Sandra was charged with wire fraud and attempted extortion. Two of her associates, the ones who'd helped structure the shell companies, took plea deals and testified against her, which is how we learned this wasn't her first attempt at something like this, just the first one that got caught. She's out on bail as of this telling, awaiting trial, and her real estate license has been suspended pending the outcome. Dana, to her credit, cooperated fully once she understood the scope of what her mother had actually done, separately from what she'd merely been complicit in enabling. The custody threats against Lily were investigated too, and turned out to have been empty. Cruelty deployed as leverage, with nothing behind it but Sandra's confidence that Caleb would fold before he ever tested it. Caleb and Dana are in counseling now, together and separately. I don't know if that marriage survives. I've stopped needing to know that in order to sleep at night. What I needed to know was that my granddaughter was safe, that my son wasn't going to be quietly hollowed out by people who saw him as a hallway to something bigger than him, and that the company my father built with 2 employees and a bank loan wasn't going to end up, on paper, belonging to a woman who never once picked up a wrench. There's a coda to this that I think about more than the rest of it combined. 2 months after that dinner, Caleb showed up at our door alone, late on a Tuesday night, and asked if he could stay for a while. Not because he was destitute, not because I'd cast him out into a storm to prove some point about consequences. He asked because he said our house was the first place in 3 years that had ever felt like it wasn't a stage he was performing on. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Ruth had his old room ready in 20 minutes, the same one he'd grown up in. And we sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd laid out that folder, and we didn't talk about any of it. We just ate pie. Lily comes to stay most weekends now. Last Saturday, she asked me to teach her how the sheet metal press works, and I told her that's exactly the kind of question her great-grandfather would have loved. I think about what I'd tell another parent standing where I stood that night in the driveway, watching my son check for scuff marks on a floor he owned. I'd tell them that love without discernment isn't love, it's just supply, and supply gets used up by people who were never planning to give anything back. I'd tell them that the hardest, most necessary thing you can do for a child who's being slowly consumed by someone else's ambition is to see it clearly before you act, and then to act like the ground beneath your feet actually depends on it, because sometimes it does. Blood gives you a claim on someone's loyalty. It doesn't guarantee it. What guarantees it, if anything does, is showing up with your eyes open when it costs you something to do it. If you've ever had to see clearly through a family member's performance to protect someone you love, I'd like to hear about it. And if this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. There's someone else in my family with a story of her own, and I think you'll want to hear what she has to say.